Hi, you're listening to Stefan Livera Podcast, a show about Bitcoin. Today for episode 289, we're talking about this idea of taking Bitcoin and Lightning Network to 1 billion users. And Roasbeef, Laolu Osuntokun, the CTO of Lightning Labs, rejoins me on the show to talk about this and updates on where the Lightning Network is today, what's going on with Lightning Labs and LND, and of course, how to take Bitcoin and Lightning to 1 billion users. So with Taproot coming in, we talk a little bit about the implications of this, as well as potential future upgrades, such as ANYPREVOUT, which will enable eltoo, enabling a much more advanced version of the Lightning Network. And how would it work if normally we're thinking of channels as a 2 of 2 situation? Well, what does that look like in a multi-party channel situation? This show brought to you by Swan Bitcoin. Swan is the best way to accumulate Bitcoin with automatic recurring buys and instant buys. Swan offer a really fast and cheap setup so you can automate your stacking plan. If you've heard my recent episode with Haas, you know the importance of automating your DCA. I like Swan's focus on education and content because the more you know, the more you buy. And Swan are also Bitcoin only, so there's no confusion with altcoins. This is the best place to send your pre-coiner and new coiner friends. Also, if you're planning to buy more than $100,000 of Bitcoin over the next year, Swan Private team is there to help you. They are there for anyone internationally, high net worth, corporates, business customers. Swan Private provides additional one-on-one guidance. You get a dedicated Bitcoin expert who's available for one-on-one calls. So go to swanbitcoin.com/Livera to set up your stacking plan, or swanbitcoin.com/private to start and sign up with Swan Private. Lend at HODL HODL is a peer-to-peer Bitcoin-backed lending platform, so you can lend stablecoins or borrow against your Bitcoin globally and anonymously. There's no KYC. So if you've got stablecoins like USDT, you can lend that out on Lend at HODL HODL and earn an average of 25% APR. On the other hand, if you have Bitcoins and you need some fiat liquidity, well, now you can borrow against your Bitcoins. And you know there's no rehypothecation. You still hold one key in the 2 of 3 multisig. HODL HODL does not hold your funds. So, Lend at HODL HODL allows peer-to-peer lending and borrowing directly between users. With this platform, you set your own terms and you put up offers depending on how long you want to borrow or lend and the interest rate you're looking to earn. Check it out, lend.hodlhodl.com. Are you interested to get involved with Bitcoin mining? Compass is an online marketplace making it easier for everyone to mine Bitcoin. The anti-cloud mining option, Compass allows you to buy your own ASIC and send it to a secure hosting facility at facilities that have been vetted by the Compass team around the world. So for years we heard mining was only profitable if you're investing tons of money and that if you had really cheap industrial power rates. Well, now Compass is making it easy for everyone to tap into those economies of scale so you can access reasonably priced hardware and cheap industrial power rates. So if you're unsure about how to get started, Compass offer hardware and hosting bundles, which eliminates the need for advanced technical knowledge. You can quickly get started mining Bitcoin with hardware that you own. Visit them at compassmining.io and start mining Bitcoin today. On to the show with Laolu. Laolu, welcome back to the show.
What's up? It's good to be back. It's been a while.
Yeah, man. There has been so much going on in the Lightning world. We are seeing an entire nation state that may be coming on to the Lightning Network. I'm sure that must be very gratifying. I mean, I think of you and my friends Rusty and Christian Decker. You guys are some of the architects of this thing. So it must be very gratifying for you to see what's happening now.
Oh, no, definitely. I mean, it was also like a surprise to me because I remember I was at the Miami conference and I was talking to people. They're like, okay, you make sure you stick around to the end. They have a really cool announcement for Stripe, yada, yada. I was like, okay, well, let's see what it actually is. And I think I was back at my hotel room and I saw it on the live stream. I was like, oh, this is for real. What? And then, I started reading a little more into it. I saw the presentation the president gave as well, to kind of explain Bitcoin, one-on-one to their citizens, directly, natively in Spanish, things like that. I was like, okay, well, this is one of those things where it's okay, things are just accelerated. So it's always kind of a thing where it's somewhat worrying and nervous. Okay, can we really keep up with it? Are we ready to pass get the ball? Are we going to drop it? Things like that. But definitely a massive opportunity. So, couldn't be more excited about this and just generally for, people to start using Bitcoin, more and more around the world, get to more and more users basically, and make sure there's a real thing actually happening out there. So it's super dope, I think.
Yeah, this is so cool. And we have maybe an enthusiast Lightning community of, call it a couple, say 20,000 or maybe a bit more than that, people who are, maybe they run a Lightning node or they've used a Lightning wallet and maybe more than that, But now we're talking about 6.5 million Salvadorans who are going to be using the Lightning Network. Now, in fairness, it's going to start small. It might only be 25% of them. And okay, fine. Many of them might be using the custodial Chivo wallet, but it's a start and they're gonna get into it, and hopefully then over time they will come down their own rabbit hole journey and learn about Bitcoin and the Lightning Network. And I look, in fairness, for many of them, they'll just use the app and that's it. That's as far as they'll
Exactly.
go. But then it's like, it's interesting now because it's like, wow, what's it going to look like when we have this many more people coming into the Bitcoin and the Lightning Network?
No, definitely. Yeah. Cause I think what you're saying as well, like, people probably just use the app initially, but I think like, at least for me, like my first Bitcoin wallet was Coinbase. I didn't know anything. I had my coins there. Like I kind of like learned over time. So, I kind of like reject the notion that, okay, well, just because they're using a custodial wallet doesn't mean they're actually using Bitcoin. It's like, well, everyone starts somewhere basically, right? And it's also a thing where it's like, they're using it to kind of like, solve their initial problem, maybe remittances or payments or referrals. And then like maybe over time, they'll kind of like get into, more and more of what's actually going on there, what's about there. I think the big thing is obviously is like, okay, well, now people have like a choice, which is obviously the bigger thing where, people haven't really had that, choice as far as their money, monetary system before. So I think that's going to be really a really big deal. But, but I guess, as far as like the tooling, so one thing I think about is, okay, well, obviously like all, our stuff typically is in the English language. So, we need to like, start to like do translations, like the wallets. And I think that's the other thing as well, like, trying to find like, the proper analog of certain like technical terms, like, how do you say force close in Spanish? I don't really know, but, I'm sure the Moon people, figuring it out as well too. I think that's another cool thing because like, there's a pretty like large developer community already in, Latin America and South America. You have like the RSK people, Moon, Ripio, a bunch of other developers that are working there as well too. So, so it's not as if like, we need to go in there and like, educate them and show what's up. They have like a pretty large community already that's there. And I'm sure they're really excited about this opportunity on their own end too. So, now we're really getting towards, like a small way towards billion users, but definitely kind of like a really cool, like, pilot basically. I'm also hearing that I think people are looking to maybe even like do like small pilots like this elsewhere around the world, maybe in the Philippines, there's in Africa, things like that as well too. So I think one of the really interesting parts about this is that, okay, like, now like, because the big thing obviously with Lightning, like, can you actually make kind of like a circular economy actually happen, right? Because if that's the case, then you basically never need to go back to the main chain. I'm getting paid, in Bitcoin over Lightning. I'm getting my paycheck. I'm like, taking care of the people. I'm actually, buying, things as well too. I think that's a really big thing there because now all of a sudden, like, the money's like moving around in the system. I think that's one thing that people don't get at times. Because, they always try to compare like, okay, well, DeFi has 100x more, locked into Lightning, blah, blah, blah. But like the thing here is that like, number one, there's kind of like the network effect. So every single link actually kind of like, is more and more additive to basically what's going on there. And the other thing there is too, like you next like, reuse the capital, right? For example, like, I was like looking at my stats, like my node today, I think I have like, 0.25, BTC, 25 million Satoshis on my node itself. And then like, I look over the past 6 months and I've done, like over 4 BTC in routing, right? So that's like an 8x reuse, in my capital alone. So it's kind of a thing where it's like, I also don't really do much. I just like, it sits there, like, I do development, things like that. I check every now and then, but I think it just shows, okay, well, things are moving around in the network itself. So therefore, like, even if you have like a small amount of, or like, millions of dollars whatever capacity in there, you can potentially do a lot more because you basically get that reuse. Now, I think it's all about that reuse basically. And this is what people, kind of like miss at times. And there's the whole like energy flood thing, blah, blah, blah. But it's kind of like, okay, well, those like 10,000 transactions I did over the past few months, that never hit the chain. And that was basically just like my computer, that's like right here, like below here, that's not really attributing to any like crazy, boiling the oceans, thing, whatever else. Like, so, but yeah, I'm definitely super excited about this. It's one of the things again where it's like, damn, like it almost felt like surreal for a little bit because I was actually like on vacation when all the news dropped. So I was like kind of disconnected, kind of, talking to people, and Lucas messaging me. He's like, yo, like, I know you're on vacation, but like this just happened, blah, blah. I was like, okay, all right, you're working on it. But no, definitely super excited about it all.
That's cool. And yeah, it's a great point there around the TVL stat that really, it's a bit misleading because really, we are growing a network here. It would be like looking at the first days of email and then saying, oh, look, I can only email 1,000 other people. That's not that useful. Well, nowadays you can email pretty much anyone. And so it's the same kind of thing. As more and more people come into the Lightning Network, now you can stay in Lightning and you don't have to go to chain. And so it's all about, and I think that's where maybe the Lightning skeptics don't quite see eye to eye with, say, the views that you and I have, because they are thinking, oh, look, every time someone has to pay me, they have to open a channel to me. But it's like, no, think of it more like once you have set up your node and you've got the channels going, you can mostly stay off chain, mostly, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And I think the other thing with the TVL stuff is that, like, many times it's like double and even triple count, right? Because, like, the things like this protocols kind of like have like recap application built in directly into what's happening, right? So, I lock up this thing, I get a token for that, I lock that up, I get a token, like, right? So, like, I can just like thread through my money 10 or 5 or 10 times, like really inflate all that stuff. Like in this case, it's like, okay, well, this is actually what's, they're publicly. The other thing that misses, obviously, like, even though, like, we've had like pretty, good growth over the past like year or so, Lightning itself, it also misses, like you're saying, all the private channels, right? So people like on the mobile nodes, all the people using, Breeze, Phoenix, Moon, everything else as well. Like, those people aren't really reflected there. But it's kind of a thing where it's like, at the end of the day, like, my mind, like, even like the actual public network doesn't even really need to be that big, because at the same time, what's really important is basically like, can you ride around failures basically? And then also, is there a single point of failure or not, right? Anything else is like, okay, well, the kind of like the barrier to entry is just so low that like now we also have like global competition as well too. Anyone that has a computer and some money can basically hop into this thing and then start using it as well too. So that's something I really, I've always ignored the whole like, oh, it's going to be centralized, blah, blah, blah. Well, look at it right now. I think to the point now where if you wanted to kind of like, even draw all the edges, in the graph, it's one of the things where it's like, okay, your rendering might slow down, just because there's just so many other connections there, right? So I mean, I think people, you definitely cannot underestimate like the power of the network effect itself. And every single node coming on basically is more and more additive, and you're kind of like adds like beyond kind of like linear value to what's going on to people actually using it as of today.
Yeah, and as an ecosystem, we're getting more and more exchanges coming online, right? So probably one of the leaders was Bitfinex. Now Kraken have said they're coming online with Lightning soon. I know OKCoin have it. I think OKX have it. Some of the smaller exchanges, Coin Corner have it. Even like a mining, one of the mining pools, I think, was it NiceHash, who are offering mining payouts on Lightning?
Oh yeah. NiceHash has it. I think maybe I've been seeing like Flesh ask some questions on like the Slack. I think maybe they're looking to add it as well too. But I think it's kind of a thing where like we definitely talked to all the people like many years ago, but it's kind of the thing where it's okay, well, I know we're not really quite ready yet. I don't want to kind of like overpromise and like have it not really work out as well too. And then maybe they're kind of like have other priorities as well too. It's also kind of the same thing where okay, like when we're both ready, it'll just kind of like happen, and that's what happened basically. Like, for example, with OKCoin, like we're on like their Telegram talking to them a little bit, like okay, like we're going live in 2 weeks. Like, oh, okay, that's cool. So I think it's also kind of like validating that people can like go from 0 to 1 without really having much hand holding, right? Like they have like pretty competent engineers themselves where we get it going, get together pretty quickly, and obviously now they're seeing like a lot of savings as well too. I think Bitfinex was saying like they added like a 0.9 BTC payment. Someone added a 1 BTC payment to like try like one up them as well too. So it's kind of a thing where it's like naysayers can say it's not happening, but like my node is routing like a multiple BTC every like month or two. So it's definitely happening. It's one of the things where it's like because there isn't like a global log of everything happening, you basically need to be tapped into in order to actually see what's going on, which is fine because it's kind of okay. Well, there's no shortcuts basically, right? And obviously, I think over time people will start to aggregate more data and things like that as well too. But I think everyone that's actually tapped into the network is like, okay, well, our numbers are going up. This is happening. Things are working, better and better over time. There's more exploration, more kind of application level development as well too. And then we have like, potentially now some, pretty significant like on the ground, adoption for these people as well too. But it's always a thing where it's like, the work stuff is never done. People will say, okay, is it still in beta? Blah blah. It's like, I mean, like except for example, like even Bitcoin D itself up until like a year or so had the beta tag, quote unquote. But it's kind of a thing where it's like it comes up kind of perpetual beta, where like software is never done. There's always new challenges, always new things to overcome as well too. So it's something that's just like an ongoing thing, and we definitely made a lot of progress and come a long way. Everyone over the ecosystem, all the developers, all the wallets, everything like that as well too. I think also in particular, wallets have gotten a lot better over the past year or two. Because like obviously there are kind of like a number of like kind of like onboarding UX challenges, but I think now the current iteration of the wallets, like it's pretty good. Like things like Phoenix, Breeze, Moon, these other ones as well. They kind of like abstract things away, and then also like start to like even modify the protocol in slight ways to basically make the UX a little bit more seamless. So maybe like you receive the open channel on the fly, things like that as well too. So I think it kind of just shows the power of like this like ground up like innovation, basically people working amongst themselves, solving their own problems, versus this kind of like top down saying, hey, this is how we do this and this and this. It's kind of okay. Well, we'll do the base stuff. You let us know what you need. You do over there. You basically like kind of like go towards your niche and your user base, and that's just kind of like what we're seeing here in terms of all the innovation going on, which is super exciting.
Yeah, that's awesome. So just for listeners who might be trying to catch a breath here, if you basically if you're new, you can just start out with one of the phone wallets like Laolu was mentioning. So things like Phoenix or Moon or Breeze are all easy wallets where they kind of manage it all in the background for you. And then for the more advanced level users, you have other wallets that you might be using to connect back with your own home node or to a VPS node or some node proper like computer that you've got set up. And that's where you might be using, say, the likes of Zeus or Zap or other wallets. And then what we're talking about now is also that the network is growing and it's becoming, we're seeing more and more volume, but it's just not that there's any top-down statistics to show, oh, this is how many payments went across the Lightning Network, because that doesn't exist. So it kind of has to be inferred out by either knowing people in the space or looking at maybe some of the data from, say the likes of a company like Bitrefill, where you can buy vouchers using the Lightning Network, or companies like Bitfinex, who are one of the big exchanges who support Lightning. So that's kind of where we're seeing a lot of this growth happen, right?
No, definitely,
Yeah.
definitely. And we're also seeing, kind of like seeing kind of like the public facing growth as well, which is basically things like node count, channel count, number, amount that's actually like in the network as well too. So those things are all definitely going up. And because I think now it's also driven by people like, coming in to like do new, novel activity. For example, like the podcasting where you're getting tipped on it, or they're doing, they're buying like things like gift cards as well too. And also like interacting with other new applications popping up, on the side. I think people also starting to see, okay, well, the fees are down right now. Well, I guess, they were a week or so ago before this like backlog of the hash rate, things like that. Let me open my channels now as well too. There's gonna be a thing where it's like, you can say it's like an advantageous thing to do to kind of like open up channels, maybe even optimistically or preemptively, basically just so you can actually be able to transact if things are being disrupted on chain for whatever reason.
Yeah, that's an interesting point around how the recent hash rate shifts can impact people who are using Lightning, because as but just for listeners, part of our security model when we're using Lightning is that we need to be able to be able to go back to chain if we need to. And I guess that's kind of getting into maybe the more adversarial aspects of it, and maybe operating Lightning in a high fee environment. So I'm wondering if you've got any maybe opening thoughts there on how Lightning Network looks when we are operating in, say, a higher fee Bitcoin on-chain environment, i.e., let's say that the fee for going on-chain might be $20 or $30 per time per chain usage. What does that look like for Lightning users?
Yeah, super good question. So, at that point you can say like the individuals that kind of like, opened up channels initially kind of like have like, you can say like kind of like prime real estate, right? They're kind of like, they're on like the whole kind of gold rush thing. They're already kind of like, in place there. I think the other interesting effect there would be kind of like, the effect of like off-chain fees relative to on-chain fees, right? Because you can say, okay, well, any given moment, maybe the on-chain fees should basically serve as a ceiling, but those go up as well too. Maybe occasionally, maybe like Lightning fees go up as well, because now it's kind of like something that's, a little more like in higher demand there. I think another important thing, something that, we've been working on, people like Antoine, other people as well, kind of like, basically trying to like, game out all the different ways that like things can go wrong when we try to go to the mempool. So things like, okay, maybe like my transactions are being pinned for some reason, maybe like RBF, messing thing up on the side or whatever else is something that, definitely like a pretty important area of research. And, for example, in the recent version of LND, we enabled something called anchor channels, which basically, by default, which basically allows you, to kind of like, bump your fee, after the fact, right? Because the things otherwise, before you kind of like had to like guess what the fee would be. So let's like, the fees right now for next block is like, 20 sided byte. I basically would say, okay, I'm going to use that, right? But then if I go offline, that goes way up. There's no way for me to update that without like cooperating with the other party, right? But in this case, I can kind of like use like something called, child fee from parent to basically like create a transaction that increases the fee of another one. And I think we're definitely seeing, this become a lot more widespread over the community as well too. One thing I've seen, I think, even explorers now basically show kind of like what the like aggregate fee will be basically. So I have like 3 transactions, they're each 5-sided byte, maybe the aggregate fee is like 2-sided byte, right? There's definitely an important thing going forward. And I think we're also working on a number of things around LND, for example, like, there's something called like you probably feel like Lightning, kind of like a CLCV delay basically for like multi-hop payments, right? So it should be the case where like, if fees are going up, you probably want to increase that because that's kind of like your security parameter to make sure you're getting into the chain in time. So we're definitely working on things like that and kind of like, making sure we have like, things like more dynamic fee bumping and stuff like that as well too. I think one other really important thing, as you can say like, maybe the chains become more gesture, chain fees are going up. Things like, like batch channel openings, so basically the ability to open, end channels in single transaction, that's super important because that basically saves you, a lot of money when you're actually, transacting on chain. Because rather than like doing, end transaction, you basically do one. I think other things, definitely something that like, I think is probably one of the things I'm kind of like, focus on now, kind of like research perspective, also particular do some of the outsider stuff is okay, like how do we actually make multi-party channels work in practice, right? Because I think something, I was saying on Twitter the other day, it's like, okay, well, it's kind of a reality where everyone probably can't have like a root UTX. So we're talking about like a billion, plus users basically. Right? So how do we kind of like, let 1,000 people go into one UTX? So, 100,000 people go into one UTX, right? So I think it's a thing where like, this has always been possible, in theory, but I think, kind of like as we work on things like pool, I started to kind of like, realize some of the kind of like, practical kind of like engineering challenges around stuff like that. But I think if we're able to achieve that, that's obviously really cool because all of a sudden, rather than like every single payment being routed across like the public network itself, you kind of like have these kind of like, subnets basically, right? So like, let's say, like 10 of us are basically in this kind of like channel ourselves, we can route our runs ourselves. And at the same time, if we really need to, let's say we want to like go to like the subnet in Los Angeles, where we can basically route, across that. This is kind of like more similar to how like the internet works, where obviously like, you and I, let's say we're using something like Comcast, like an ISP in the internet, we kind of like route within their network, but we need to go to, something like AT&T, we kind of like, go through the public internet, things like BGP as well too. So I think we're definitely heading in that direction just because I feel like the public graph only really needs to be so large and you definitely get a lot of savings because the thing is, if you're able to kind of like, correlate or co-locate, kind of like things that have like, locality of the payments, either from a use case perspective or even geographically, you save a lot because then at that point, you basically need to only do routing if you need to kind of like go across some other locale, basically. And the other cool thing about that is then like, we can then have like the payments within like a particular kind of like sub locale or like subnet, just having a little more seamlessly. And then maybe there's even the possibility of kind of like doing offline payments within that locale as well too. I think definitely it will be like a really big thing going forward to basically, make sure we're actually able to, bring in all these other users in a seamless manner.
Yeah, right. So let's try to break some of those aspects down. I think the important part is I think probably the key part is the constraint, as you were saying. Literally, if just for listeners who aren't familiar, there's literally if you will, an upper bound on how many people can hold a coin, UTXO, unspent transaction output. And so what you're talking about there is how do we find ways to sort of batch that? Now, I guess one way is even literally just more like a lightning bank, right? So even say Bitcoin Beach, Elzonte, Nicholas Berti from Galoy Money was talking about how, just as an example, they had the Bitcoin Beach wallet and they've got thousands of users there. I think he put some stats out the other day saying he had done 7,000 transactions, of which only 14 had to actually go on chain. So that's one way, but obviously that's custodial. So what you're talking about here is more like, how would we enable it in a way that's, a little bit more closer to the non-custodial side? Right. Could you explain a little bit around, I guess, maybe like what that UTXO constraint is and how we would, what's the technology that we would need to go above and beyond where we are now?
Sure. No, definitely. I definitely think kind of like the whole like community bank stuff like Bitcoin Beach is pretty interesting because I feel like at the end of the day it's kind of like a federated coin lease type of thing, right? Okay, well, people aren't really kind of like more directly locked into there. You can kind of like route amongst other individuals as well too, and you kind of like have the interoperability to basically deal with the off-chain transactions between other big people. So I think it's really interesting. But I guess the part about like the kind of like the constraints. Remember like it's like in like 2015, 2016 or so, like Taj, Driver kind of like had this analogy called kind of like the bathtub, right? Kind of like the Bitcoin bathtub. On one side, basically like the blocks are like super tiny and like only a few individuals can actually validate the thing. On the other side, like the blocks are like super large, but then at the same time because they're so big, people can't even really do the validation there, right? So where kind of like say like this whole UTXO constraint thing comes into play is that you can like look at just kind of like the back of the envelope map as far as like having like a billion people actually onboard into Bitcoin like serially. You can say them doing like one transaction a day, like it would take basically like years, right? But then at the same time as well too, if you look at kind of like the marginal addition of any individual on like the UTXO set database itself, starts to get very, very large, like gigabytes, terabytes even as well too. Those are kind of like constraints where like if things get too big, it can be a case that like either you basically need to like wait in line for 2 years to join Bitcoin, kind of like a weird you're queuing up basically everything, or you can join it, but then you need some like massive computer to basically keep up with things as well, right? So now like the district is saying, okay, well what if you can kind of like have people be compressed into like a single output, right? So like vanilla things like right now we basically have like two of us, right? So it's a 2 of 2, we can move money back and forth, right? So then you say, okay, well what if it was a 3 of 3, right? Okay, now at that point like the 3 of us can do payments by just like updating our balances. Like I propose a state, the 3 of us sign it, then go things like that, right? But then once you start to go in that direction, you start to run into challenges as far as like kind of like the communication complexity of the messages, right? Because now it's okay, well, the 3 of us each need to like send each other and receive a message in order to do the proposal, right? But then as you start to go into 100, 1,000, things like that as well too, you start to get this kind of like, like n squared, type of like, complexity as far as like messages being passed back and forth as well too. So then, people in the past, things like channel packages, okay, well, what if we have kind of like a root multi-sig that has everyone in the root multi-sig, but at the same time, we kind of like have like a tree structure, right? So first we have like the 3 of 3, then we break that up into basically the combinations of every single 2 of 2 amongst ourselves, right? Okay, that's a cool thing now, because now we can update the channels once again with that limited overhead, which is the 2 of us passing together. At the same time, we can then say, okay, well, I want to like go more into Stefan's channel. Let me do kind of like a rebalance overhead there, right? Then you can kind of like generalize that to basically more and more participants. So one thing is that like so the reason why people are really excited about things like L2 is that it kind of like makes certain parts of this things a little bit easier, right? Because otherwise, like with the revocation model, if you want to like do revocation of like 10 people, there's some questions around kind of like, okay, well, if someone breaches, who gets the money? But then also kind of like what if I breach, then they breach, and then we breach, and then that type of thing. There's this kind of like blow up as far as like the number of like safety needs to handle. While the L2 model kind of like it's I like to call it more generic, kind of like replaced by version rather than like replaced by revocation. Where basically you say, okay, well, I would promise not to broadcast it. If I do, I get punished. We basically say, okay, well, the highest sequence number is basically the one that's most valid. This is a little bit easier because now the 10 of us can basically kind of like have the state then move forward, and it's also a little bit more simple because you kind of like have a symmetric state as well too. There's no longer a version of the transaction for every single participant, which makes things a little bit easier in that domain, right? So there's just kind of like high level certain like kind of like challenges that people need to kind of like grapple with. I definitely think so I think it's the case where I think if you try to like put too many, like at least with the current tools we have available today, if you try to like, put too many individuals, maybe it doesn't really scale, but then you can say, okay, well, maybe we'll have like 1,000 person per channel, right? And then at that point we can kind of like, have and basically, kind of like shard that out, quote unquote, basically to have like, a series of these and then actually like have payments, work between them, but then also within the channels as well. These are things that we talk about in the wild. I think Z has an idea. He calls them like nodelets. This is like ZM something. I can't remember what the actual thing is. But yeah, Z-Man, synonymous developer. So I think it's a thing where like over time, I think it's something that's going to become increasingly more important. I think the other cool thing about this is that like, if you're able to make this stuff work out, you can then also improve UX a lot more, right? Because now at this point, it's like, okay, well, it's like, the thing is like, if you're standing next to me, I give you a $10 bill, I know you're going to get it, right? I don't have to worry about, it falling, along the way, right? But you can say, okay, when you go in the writing context, something can happen. Maybe the door is closed. Maybe someone, took 7, they should take 5, whatever else. So if you can kind of like, analogize that, say, okay, well, if we're in the same channel, I know I can just, push that over to on that end. But at the same time, if I need to interact with someone else that's like not in like our, a club or guild or kind of like, a close friend group, basically, I can then go and then route that elsewhere. And I think it's then will start to resemble basically like how the internet works today. As far as like you kind of like have these autonomous systems, they kind of like, have ISPs within them. They have like providers, stuff like that. And then you kind of like have these exchange points, and that exchange point, in the setting of Lightning is basically these public routing channels.
Yeah. Okay. So it's, I guess thinking about Lightning as it exists today, part of how it works is, as an example, if I set the channel up with you, we trade each other back and forward the pre-signed states, and then if we ever need to go to chain unilaterally, either side of us can publish that to the blockchain, to Bitcoin, and blah, 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 right? But then what you're talking about is how do we get that beyond just two people? How do we create that kind of arrangement for 3 people or 5 people or 100 or 1,000 people? And and then, so as you were saying, the complexity associated with that, given the current technology we have, is very difficult. But hopefully once we get things like ANYPREVOUT and potentially, is it CTV as well? Check template verify, where that can enable this kind of thing. So I guess maybe, and so for listeners as well, check out episode 200 with Christian Decker. We went into detail on ANYPREVOUT and what that kind of enables in the eltoo space. But from your perspective, then what are the logical next upgrades to Bitcoin that would enable this kind of future? Like, are you looking at ANYPREVOUT and CTV, or what are you looking at?
Good question. I mean, so I guess like, I feel like at times people like get into like some weird discourse as far as like what's next. This is the next thing, we're going to do this. But like, I like how view is more kind of like holistically. It's like, okay, well, if we want to get to this goal of like 1 billion users, like any one of those things in isolation is nice and incrementally, but like, maybe it doesn't really like allow us to like really achieve what we want to, do overall, right? So I think there's this concept like kind of like, which I like try to use as kind of like an example is like something that like Jeremy Rubin, Antoine and Gleb and other people were kind of like concept of like basically like payment pools, right? So like rather than like having like one individual or 2 individuals kind of like in a channel, let's try to like basically have a set of individuals, right? And like the area where you always run challenges is okay, well like how do you allow any given individual to basically withdraw unilaterally from the pool without needing to update or notify any of their other individuals as well too, right? So if everyone's online, they can sign a new state, blah blah. But how do I make sure I kind of like have that unilateral withdrawal? And that's also like a big thing with Lightning is okay, well at any point I want to exit, I can always just force close, boom, everything's fine, take my money. So there's kind of like some challenges around like how do we achieve things like that. So I definitely obviously no one puts amazing. I remember like I wrote like a very early version of it like 2015 or so because I think the one thing is that like why it's so valuable is that whenever you're off chain, like you need to kind of like deal with a bunch of different possibilities, right? And those possibilities are typically expressed in front of a TXID, and therefore it means like my signature, I basically need a new signature for every single possibility, right? But then like things like no one could say, okay, well let me just kind of like categorize this thing where it's okay the 3 of us, and then no matter what happened before that, I can like kind of like retain that signature. So once again, it kind of like helps to reduce kind of like complexity, and then also kind of like like space footprint and things like that in terms of like getting the protocols working. So stuff like CTV is also really important because, for example, like this would let you do kind of like things like batch channel opening on like a very like massive scale, right? So like the one little trick with CTVs, you basically like you kind of like publish one transaction, and then it kind of like has like a what I call like a bounded covenant basically that commits to every single possible state, and then once that's in the chain, that lets you basically move forward with everything else. So obviously I basically like have like one transaction on chain, and I know that eventually these 300 channels will open eventually, right? And the cool thing about that too is that like once that transaction is published on chain, you can basically start to use those other channels like off chain immediately, right? Because even though they don't have direct confirmation themselves, it's kind of a thing where it's like, it must follow, right? Whereas like, maybe it's going to take a while, but things must follow from there, which definitely we will value thing. Other stuff I think is, definitely important, for moving forward, things like checking on stack, kind of like the ability to like, verify an arbitrary signature message pair, which sounds like very simple and obviously something that we do already. Like, we've done a bunch of work, people around like optimized signatures, new approach, things like that as well too. But things like that would let you do really cool things. For example, like one thing I've been touring around with is like, okay, it's kind of like a concept, I guess, jumping around a little bit, kind of like one thing I think is very important is kind of like off-chain channel funding, right? So once again, this is about around the constraint of, okay, well, how do we onboard 1 million people onto Lightning today? So obviously, like the vanilla way is basically we need like maybe 1 million transactions, maybe we can batch that, maybe we can get 200,000, 300,000, whatever else, but that's still very slow, very expensive, right? So what is possible for me to basically join a channel off-chain, right? And the reason why this is kind of challenging is, okay, like as I mentioned a little bit earlier, so let's say like, we have that 3 of 3, multi-sig between you, me, and someone else, like your friend, right? Let's say we want to like, have Bob join the channel. So things, Bob can join the channel. Let's say we basically make a new output for him, basically like, deliver input to the channel output itself. But because he's not in the 3 of 3 multi-sig, we can just spend that again and remove his output. Right. So he, he needs to trust one of us basically in order to like not do that thing itself. So I think like that's probably okay in many cases, depending on the trust model. Once again, like, there's definitely like a grade for, noob and advanced users as well too. But it's kind of things like, ideally we can basically make that like work in a more direct setting. So one thing I've been turning around with is basically, what if I have like, kind of like some coins on chain, right? Like these are coins I'm kind of like fronting up, kind of like a bond concept, right? But then let's like, whenever Bob joins, I basically do kind of like a, like a fig exchange type protocol, script type stuff, whatever else, basically give him what's effectively like a voucher that lets him claim that on-chain output, right? So therefore, even though we've done no transactions on chain, he basically has a good enough claim on that on-chain output basically. And then maybe we'll be comfortable to using this output, off-chain, and then we go from there as well too. And, seems like in my mind, the things you need to do that are kind of like, more, kind of like, you can say covenants that allow kind of like partial application, right? So let's say I had like a contract on chain basically, and the contract said, okay, well, if Roastbeef signs a message with your public key and an amount, you can withdraw that amount from this output basically, and you must thread back, the amount that's remainder there to everyone else, right? So all of a sudden now you can basically give me, we do this like protocol off chain, I get kind of like a signature over this message basically, and the contract can then parse that message and then do things like that. And I think it's definitely super powerful because IAM's view is this is like one of the things that like I think we really need in Bitcoin to basically do more advanced smart contract functionality. And I think a good way people describe it, because maybe it sounds a little scary, it's kind of like, okay, we have like a state machine, right? Basically the states are deposit, withdrawal, challenge, things like that, right? You can kind of like draw a similar thing for things like Lightning. Basically, okay, channel's opening, it's closing, force close, CSV, things like that as well too. This would let you kind of like encode that state machine, in the Bitcoin script itself, and like have that just run even non-interactively, right? So like in the future, let's like once again like another toy example. Let's say I have like a very like basic covenant. Basically, it takes a public key and a hash, and then goes to another state. Right. And then that nether state, basically, you need to reveal the previous to that hash. And the final stage is basically, it's like a coin flip, right? So all of a sudden, now I can basically make this contract on chain. It's the coin flip contract. And then people can kind of like interact with that, non-interactively themselves, right? And so I think some people, get worried about stuff like this. Okay, is it too much, blah, blah, blah. Like, I guess in my mind, because you can always kind of like, draw like the actual like finite state machine thing itself, it's a lot less scary than something like another chains. So one of the issues with other chains, like, you kind of like have like basically global state. But then you also have like a state where like, any contract can basically call any other contract very directly, right? So like, let's say I want to do like a withdrawal. I call withdrawal. I don't know what's happening there. Basically, it's a black box for me. I'm like, okay, well, Jesus take the wheel. Don't still steal my money, right? But in this case, because I know exactly what the contract can do, it's a lot more understandable. Even though it's a lot more constrained, it still I think is immensely powerful. Basically, I think it's almost like just where I'm thinking kind of like really like a prerequisite for us to kind of like create these more kind of like elaborate kind of like like ownership structures on chain basically that still once again allows the most important thing: can I withdraw my money? And you always need to have that in there, because otherwise you're gonna have with things like, okay, well, my money's stuck in the contract, are they gonna hard fork and help me get out? Like, we definitely want to avoid that stuff. We don't want just people like losing money left and right. So it may take some time to kind of like get towards that golden design, but I think definitely we shouldn't try to like do everything all at once basically and postpone these things. Like once again, I feel like not that there's like time pressure, but it's just kind of a thing where it's like it is feasible to miss opportunity in the short term, and then maybe it rises in the mid and long term, but it's not really clear, right? So definitely like things like no input, CTV, type from stack, things like that as well. Just what are just seem to be like very easy wins. Right now they give us time to basically like do a lot of the background research, but at the same time kind of like empower developers to basically make more elaborate things on chain basically. And then from there on, once again we have this kind of like very iterative evolutionary process where people just kind of like do their own things. And this whole like permissionless invasion thing where like someone's probably gonna come up with something that you had no idea was even possible. They're like, oh, that's cool. And then you work on that. And that's kind of like what I think is so cool about Bitcoin, open source, and just the space in general, just like how creative people are and how much you can do just because, because I just feel like, always the limiting thing is just like imagination, basically, right? As long as you have like the proper tooling, you have some imagination there, definitely a lot of cool things you can start to build.
Yeah, that's really fascinating as an answer there. So basically, in response to this idea of what's next, it's more open-minded. If I had to interpret what you're saying, it's more like, hey, if we're going to create this stuff and see what people are using, see what research comes out of it. And so I think the obvious probably two would be ANYPREVOUT and CTV, check template verify. But let's say we got ANYPREVOUT, well then we could upgrade the network to the quote unquote eltoo Lightning Network, which is like the upgraded form. And that would have all sorts of improvements and implications, like backups would be easier and cheaper to do. It would enable this, starting this multi-party channel approach. But at the end of the day, it's still just going to be, you develop something and see how people are using it. And as that grows, then you build further into that. And then later, once you get a new capability, let's say in the future, after that, we get CTV. Well, then maybe that enables another whole aspect of, say, batch channels or non-interactive channels, right? And so I guess bringing it back to that, I guess the fundamental problem here we're talking about is that in each block, on average, it might be 3,000 transactions in a Bitcoin block. That happens every 10 minutes. And so if somebody has to try and shoot to get into that block, well, and obviously there is a block space market. So you pay more fee, you're more likely to get confirmed faster. But in the Lightning context, it's just more like you want to make sure that, let's say you're not getting cheated out of your money, or you at least can claim back. Or let's say maybe a more likely scenario is you've got some money in a Lightning bank and you want to try to claim it back into your custody. So bring it back to the root UTXO tree unrolling. Maybe if you could just elaborate a little bit there. Like the idea is that, there might be this multi-party construct going on. Let's say we've got ANYPREVOUT and we've got eltoo and we have this kind of multi-party construct going, and it's about each individual being able to claim their aspect out if they need to, or spend it out if they need to unilaterally without first asking the permission from everyone else in their little channel group, or I don't know the word, channel factory, or whatever term we're going to use for that. So then it's a question of, could they still do it even under adversarial conditions? Could they still do it if the fee market if the block space, if fees are getting higher, or could they still do it if, because with Lightning, there's still security things we have to think about. An example might be griefing, right? So if somebody has tried to channel jam and grief you, what does it look like then in a multi-party context, right?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, yes. So I think things like that, like, okay, we recognize this thing is just good in terms of like scaling Bitcoin up, making we have more users as well too. Like, what do we need in order to like actually achieve that stuff, right? And I think the other thing, like, the things that you mentioned, things like CTV and so forth, we're all also kind of like, make it easier to actually even just hold Bitcoin generally, right? Because you basically make things like vaults, right? Which kind of like allow you to kind of like have like a backup key. Someone steals your coins, you can kind of like reject that and like basically like drive them crazy because they can actually move the coins there as well too. So I think we definitely, obviously these are like very fundamental things, security and scalability of the system. And I feel like those can be kind of like things developers can basically rally behind and say, okay, well these are the things we really care about. Let's move forward. Like what do we need in order to basically allow these things to move forward? At a proper pace, but at the same time doing so in a kind of a more careful manner, right? And then even with that, there's a bunch of things like, for example, there's like basics of like today you can't multiply two integers in script, right? In Bitcoin script itself. So remember, like there was just like this developer, I guess he's working on Liquid Sidechain. He basically showed his version of doing this, and it basically, I think he did it, but I think the script that he did to do this was like over like 1.3 kilobytes, right? So once again, like something super simple like multiplication, but obviously that's just like a disabled opcode, right? It's one of the things where like Sergi was like, okay, well, I don't really know how this other stuff works. Let me just like clamp this down. Probably a good decision back then because obviously we know way more than we did now than we did back then. But I think those are kind of like once again things that in my mind like, okay, well, I don't think multiplication is a scary task. Obviously, the contract needs to basically handle like things like overflow and underflow if like the numbers are basically too big. But beyond that, I think it's a very tractable thing. And just even maybe do something like that would really increase the possibilities of what's happening there. So I guess I'm kind of like more in like the like progressive camp of like Bitcoin development. I don't like things like crazy ossification, things like that as well too. Just because I just know I've seen like how quickly spaces evolve basically, and I think it's also a thing where like if we're gonna like actually allow Bitcoin to continue to grow and like really basically like start to like test people around the world. Basically, we need to like move forward these things incrementally. Of course, I definitely think that like I think people are starting to like get back in the swing of making more kind of like targeted direct changes after the 2017 stuff, segment blah blah. So I think the other cool thing right now is like one thing that I really like with the way like ST like the speedy trial proposal work is like okay, like now at this point we know that like so many things go well. Basically, we can basically start to use Taproot in November, October. So I think this is really big for companies. For example, for us, I'm like okay, well I can start to design things today and I can deploy it versus this kind of like weird uncertainty thing, is it going to happen or not, whatever else. So I really like that pattern. I think initially I was kind of like I didn't really grasp why it was. I was like, oh, it's another parameter, more problems, more parameters, more problems type of thing. But then I was like, okay, no, this is actually really ingenious, and definitely credit to Russell O'Connor and else that basically worked on this thing going forward. So I'm hopeful that this thing will work out basically, and then people can like see it as a thing going forward. We can basically do this thing. Obviously, the UASF stuff is always in kind of like the back pocket. I kind of like analogize to basically kind of like a concealed carry. It's like okay, well I'm walking around, I got like a deagle, right here. You're probably not gonna, you're not gonna try me. You know what I mean? Like you're not gonna try to roll up. I don't need to have it pulled out and locked and loaded. Be scaring people. It's like okay, it's a concealed carry. So it's all about deterrence basically. So I think I kind of like these dynamics. We basically have like something to basically, can we reject it? Can it happen fast or not? If not, there's kind of deterrence. So I think we're kind of like feeling out exactly how these things are happening in practice. So I think sometimes people want to kind of like have like the perfect way to do it. I don't think that really exists, right? Because we're dealing with people, with humans, basically, different incentives, things like that as well too. I think like good enough just to make sure things are moving forward. That's probably pretty good. And then another thing as well is probably not going to have every single component that you want, but that's okay as well too. As long as basically like meets the goal and basically move things forward. Maybe you wanted this or that. You wanted like a different representation, or whatever else. Those are kind of like trivial parameters. I think we need to like make sure we're looking at kind of like the big goal basically, and like why we're all here in the first place, and not get caught up in these kind of like this or that type of things, which obviously pop up in software engineering all the time, right? Because like programming is a lot of ways to do a given task, right? And there's no best way, but you can kind of like reason about the trade-offs of certain one of them. But I think we have a pretty good thing here in ST, and hopefully we can reuse it again maybe sometime next year or something like that, and see how these things go forward. But yeah, because I remember like back in the day, like when I started joining, we kind of like had a software every 6 or so months. I'm not saying like we need something like that itself, but I think just even like the notion in like the investor's mind, particularly like the new people, that okay, well the thing can evolve and move forward. That's a pretty powerful thing. But once again, it is the case where like you can say kind of like the core value of Bitcoin itself, nothing really needs to change. You can say, and that would basically just work out. But I think we can say, okay, well the world is changing itself too. Can we start to kind of like encompass more and more users basically, and then once again like upholding those like very base principles that we know should not change basically, and they kind of like underlie what people feel is kind of like the value of the system itself. Because I think we're definitely seeing people wake up more and more, because I think it's kind of a thing where it's like I feel like there's something that happened to me as well too. I remember like I heard about Bitcoin, I was like, okay, whatever else, that's cool. And then a few years later I was like, oh, it's still there. So I think people are having that kind of like I had like kind of like light bulb, okay, it's still there. A lot of stuff's going on around the world. Maybe I should look into this thing again. And they weren't really crazy. And, so I think it's definitely interesting to see all these kind of like, like old heads, like the OG investors, blah, 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 change their mind, which is obviously like a very powerful thing, and something that any, human being needs to be able to do to kind of like, not hold their principles too tightly, to basically, like, kind of like have new information, update their mental models. I'm seeing all this coming. I'm like, okay, this is really good. So, I definitely, what a time to be alive. And to be working on Bitcoin, just being, interacting with all this stuff. It's the craziest, like massive, like experiment on an even increasingly more global scale now, right? So now we have, people in like, offices of power, politicians talking about it, like they kind of like actually like can enact direct change. So I'm definitely, really excited to see what's going on in Salvador there. I think the one thing I thought was really cool, it just seemed like they have like, more kind of like technologically literate kind of like politician, just kind of like like based in terms of their government, which I think is just so different from the U.S. in that, like, just feel like we have a bunch of dinosaurs, right? Like, I remember I saw the presentation by the Salvadoran president. I was like, yo, he's giving a slide deck, Bitcoin 101, Lightning, things like that. I'm like, can Biden even make a PowerPoint?
Yeah, does he even mention the word Lightning Network?
Yeah. So I don't know. I feel like that just like really just charges me up. I was like, damn, like this dude gets it. This can really be really big for them as well too, just in terms of kind of their opportunities they have possibly, as far as like increasing stage of the country, more economic opportunities, jobs, things like that as well too. So you definitely can't downplay it. I thought it was interesting when it first came. People were like, oh, it's just El Salvador. It's like, okay, come on, like you can't. This is a big deal. This is a big deal.
Only small companies. Oh, now it's only a small country, right? It's just going to keep going. Exactly. Only a small continent is the next one, right?
Yeah, and like obviously it made other countries be like, oh, that's an option, So it's one of those
You
things.
can do that?
Yeah, where someone like plays a move, like it's like, oh, like like they're like, oh, you can do that. Well, it's like, yeah, we're kind of rewriting the rules, right? And that's why all this stuff is so fun.
Okay, back to the show after a word for the sponsors. Have you thought about multi-signature and upgrading from a single signature setup? Unchained Capital are building Bitcoin native financial services on a foundation of multi-signature. So you can create a 2 of 3 vault, meaning you might have 2 hardware wallets as an example, 1 cold card and 1 Trezor, and you can create a setup where you hold 2 keys geographically distributed and Unchained holds the 3rd key as that 3rd signing party if you ever need them. Now, you can set this up for free with no setup or storage if you build it on your own. On the other hand, they've got a concierge service. They'll do calls with you, ship you hardware wallets, answer your questions, and deposit $1,000 of Bitcoin in your vault. Use code Livera to get a discount there, and Unchained offer all sorts of other products and services like advanced business accounts. They offer an OTC desk in certain states, as well as lots of free content on their website, such as Parker Lewis's Gradually Then Suddenly series. Go to unchained.com to find out more. CoinKite.com are the creators of my favorite Bitcoin hardware wallet, the Cold Card. So the Cold Card is special because you can use it in an air-gapped way, meaning you can get an SD card and ferry the transactions back and forth and ferry the XPub data between your Cold Card and your computer wallet, like Spectre Desktop or Sparrow or Electrum or others. The Cold Card is a really advanced piece of technology, and it's there to help you secure your Bitcoins. It can operate as part of a single signature setup or as part of a multi-signature setup, so it's really worthwhile looking into. Go to coinkite.com and use the code Livera to get a discount on your Cold Card. And finally, cyphersafe.io, producing metal seed backup products. So when you write down those 24 words for your Bitcoin hardware wallet, you need somewhere to put that in a metal product. Now, CipherSafe have a new one coming out. It's called CipherGrid. This is the best value in the industry. You get everything you need for $59. It's got 2 stainless steel plates for all 24 seed words. It's got privacy by default. It's stainless steel hardware holding it together. You can lock it with a padlock. You get a tamper-evident seal and an automatic center punch provided, so you can punch in 4 letters for each word. And just like all CipherSafe products, it's made from stainless steel. It's fireproof, rust-proof, and waterproof. So make sure you or your loved ones can access your Bitcoins if an accident occurs. Go to cyphersafe.io and use the code Livera to get yours. Back to the show. Yeah, and going back to your comment earlier, it's very interesting, that idea of Bitcoin conservatives and Bitcoin progressives, right? Because there are people who maybe want new features, and then on the Bitcoin conservative side, it might be more like, no, just 21 million and that's it. And I think the interesting part is absolutely that we are getting new features over time, but also people always have to remember, if you don't like it, you don't have to use it. You can stay on chain.
Exactly.
Right?
And I think that's the thing that people miss times with soft forks. Like the beauty of soft forks is that, like, okay, we don't need everyone, at the same time to hit go at, right? Because that itself is like a very centralizing force. So the thing is where it's like, even if you're not really using a feature, as long as it doesn't, like mess up the integrity of your own coins, like your security model itself, it's really okay, right? So I feel like at times people, with the whole USF thing, try to like, make sure, because once again, like I think this thing gets lost is like, okay, well, the community didn't approve it. All the users need to approve it. And that's kind of a thing where it's like, if we could measure community approval and consensus like that, we wouldn't really need POW, right? We would say, okay, well, everyone says do this. Like, it was like, that's the thing where it's like, it's hard to sample, which is why, like, we have things like the hash rate itself, the price of the coin, people have done futures in the past, things like that as well too. And the one principle, again, like, because it's a software, it's completely opt-in, you don't want to use it, you don't really need to use it, right? So I think something people lose sight on, and like, it feels like they want hard forks instead, and like, like I guess like in nominally, but at the end of the day, like soft forks work pretty well. We've done a bunch of them right now, and obviously, there's. I mean, I think that thing's well, like definitely isn't zero risk with the soft fork too. You still can have fission things like that as well too, but you kind of like need to kind of like have like a more principled approach going about it and kind of like evaluate the benefits and the trade-off, things like that as well too. And once again, worst case, because like there are people that haven't updated their Bitcoin nodes in 2013 or so that are probably like major holders, and to them though, okay, well, at this point in the system, this is what I bought into. And as long as that doesn't change, that's fine. Y'all in 2020 do, newfangled stuff or whatever else. As long as my coins are okay, that's fine. So I think that's an important thing that, it's kind of like a big thing for people need to uphold, and also kind of like embrace that, okay, well, things can move forward, but as long as like your own, kind of security is modified, it's fine. It's kind of because otherwise it's kind of like, you have this weird thing like, what are you crazy kids doing over there? You gotta stop all that. It's like, well, like, sir,
get off my lawn.
Yeah, sir, your coins are okay. Like, what are you doing? So I think it's all good.
Yeah. And I think it's also interesting. One way to put it is, even if we didn't use all these fancy things with the Lightning Network and upgrading to multi-party channels and so on, even the Lightning Bank approach, even having that, like many Lightning Banks distributed around the world, right? Bitcoin Beach style wallets, and maybe they would have proof of reserves, which is a feature that the team at Galloy Money are looking at, that even that would be a massive, massive improvement of the current financial system.
Exactly.
So what we're going for here is extra credit. We're making it. We're looking for like,
No, I think it's definitely a good way to put it. Like, I guess I like to live in kind of like that, like extra credit lane. I think the other thing that people shouldn't forget is like, for the first time people kind of like have like a choice, right? And the other thing as well, like, there definitely very much is like a gradient of full custodial to I have like my own node. I do cold storage, like multi-sig, blah blah, things like that as well too. I think it's fine that people, depending on like the level of competence or technical literacy, can like lie in any point of that gradient basically. But the fact that exists at all is a big thing, because before people were just born into, okay, this is my option. Here's Wells Fargo. Here's the same thing, in the background anyway, right? So I think that's definitely something really cool, and it's also just like, once again, like very surreal to basically see kind of like things brought in more and more, where now like people like the Fed are talking about Bitcoin, things like that, and they compare it to gold, try to dismiss it, but we're like, okay, well, yeah, it's better, right? So it's just, I don't know, it's definitely super exciting. It just feels surreal at times, basically, like how much stuff has expanded over time, basically, and just that this thing is still going. Because I feel like people, the one thing I was like saying, okay, well, a block was produced 15 minutes ago, right, or 4 minutes ago. It's still happening. Like the chain is still working, it's still going, Powell's still training. Doesn't really care about anything else is going on. But no, I mean, like, once again, I just love working on this stuff, and it's really amazing.
That's cool, man. One other thing that just came to my mind as well, when we're talking about this idea of trying to, going for extra credit, as it were, this idea of having multi-party channels, whatever we're going to call them, so coming back to what we were saying earlier, that, on average, it's kind of 2,000 or 3,000 transactions in a Bitcoin block on average, let's say, and what happens if a lot of people all need to claim back on chain at the same time?
Exactly. No, yeah. No, super good question. So like, this is something that like is definitely still like a challenge. Like, it's something that like, is just like a fundamental constraint. Like the whole like Pinot principle, basically, you have like 8 slots, you have 10 people. Obviously not everyone can get a slot. So I think one thing is super important on this, like, I think Jeremy Rubin's done like really cool bunch of work around kind of like, what he calls kind of like congestion control, basically. So like the ability to kind of like, have initial transaction going to the chain, and that transaction basically like allows you to kind of like, have different forms, maybe even different fee rates, different packages, basically depending on kind of like, how the chain is going on from there, right? So now, I think another thing that people worked on in the past is kind of like the concept of like, possibly having like, congestion and or fee aware time like operations, within the system itself, right? So the idea would be to say, okay, like, we encode into the contract, if the fee rate is over, hundreds of satabyte in a box like that, we can like pause it and like, move it on for things like that, right? But that stuff was like never fully completed. I definitely think it's probably like some more stuff there, basically, as far as like, making sure, things can basically unroll, in an efficient manner on chain. But I think that's the other thing, which is like, another challenge of the whole like unilateral withdrawal thing, right? Like, what if everyone's withdraw, at the very same time, basically? Like, how do you architect that, things like that as well too? And I definitely think that's like a major point of research. Like, once again, things that like, we can like, devise to basically help to like, mitigate and solve those problems. I think those are definitely super high priority in my mind, because, once again, we want to make sure that people can like, basically always go back to layer 1, which once again, like, you have the coins there. That's the de facto, basically. If it's not the UTXO set, if it's not the UTXO set and you can't make it, exist in there, like, it's not your UTXO, not your coins, type of thing, right? Like a different way around it as well too. But I think definitely something that's so super important. But in particular, kind of like, things like people working on stuff like package relay as well too, just to be kind of like ensure like, I can actually get into the chain and I can like modify my fees, and things like that as well too. And I can say, something else that like, people looked at in the past, which I think is kind of like a big thing, just in terms of like, letting people evolve stuff going for more forwards. Like, maybe people should make more kind of like, liquid style side chains, right? Or maybe like, try to add the ability to basically like allow them to exist in a more trust minimized way. Obviously, once again, it's not going to be as good as base chain, but like, for example, like, in my mind, like, feasibly, like, where else would we have something like, CTO, or more advanced thing to be deployed in a wide scale? You can say maybe it's too, complex, or kind of like, implications or whatever else are, too far fetched to basically happen on chain. But then what if we can have you move those things out? So I think it's a thing where it's like, obviously Lightning sharing is cool, but like, we definitely don't want to like, be like kind of be like a one trick, kind of like chain type of thing, right? We want to kind of like, have other options, other security models, other ways people can interact with things as well too. Just because like you can say like, in the end, it's my, kind of like, they'll probably all be like somewhat, additive basically. I can like, move my coins over here. I can do this thing here and there and things like that as well too. So I think that kind of like, outwards evolution is super important. And also just to be able to allow people to kind of like, rapidly experiment and kind of like, arrive on their own kind of like, local, optimal solution basically, and then collaborate with other individuals too. So, but yeah, so I'm definitely all about the extra credit. I think, I think obviously like the base, the base report is nice, and obviously it's the everything that we rallied around. I think the extra credit is important to basically kind of like, expand things more and more, and then basically enable people to basically opt into the system, like anything else. And you can say, okay, maybe they're kind of like, and like wandering in the desert with Doge and Shiba and whatever else. But like at the end of the day, I want to make sure they have a slot. You know what I mean? I think they'll come out eventually. Once they're done, being wayward, they can come back. They can come back
out there in the Keynesian wastelands until they join us in our sound money citadel of Bitcoin. So I guess then the answer is if there's a lot of people all trying to reclaim back on chain at once, we're reliant then on research around things like, as you said, package relay. Our friend Gloria Zhao with mempool accept that might sort of play into that as well. This idea of being able to have your Bitcoin node see a transaction, see that it's not being confirmed, but be able to construct its own, I guess, transactions based off of that then allow you to maybe go. Maybe I don't understand this as well as you do, but maybe you might be leaving one channel factory to join another one or something like that. That kind of construction. Is that the sort of thing that would be possible?
Yeah, because like, another thing as well is like, for example, you can say like, like let's say there's kind of like thousands of people who are trying to like handle like their own breach at the same time. Like, what if they can kind of like cooperate basically and kind of like have one transaction that's settled, all the contracts, in one single transaction basically, instead, that'll definitely save a lot on chain space because you kind of like, you compress down things, you kind of like have like a batching life savings as well too. So I guess that's definitely something that's kind of like, within current like technical feasibility. The only thing that it requires there is kind of like, kind of like a coordination layer to allow people to kind of like discover themselves and also change messages and things like that, right? But definitely like things are probably further off. It's kind of like maybe reviving certain ideas around like how do you have like congestion or weird time locks, things like that as well too. Just because otherwise there's that kind of like constraint there. And maybe there's a way to even like allow them to like reconcile off chain. Be like, okay, my bad. Like, like we're both not going to get you over here. My bad. Let's just settle up. Okay, it's all good. Like no hard feelings. Like maybe that's possible as well too. Just to kind of like go from different direction. But I think these are definitely all I think kind of some like very like the key research questions right now. I remember like I think I saw on Twitter it was like Jonas, Nick, and someone else, Lloyd. I think they had like a thing kind of like open Bitcoin research question basically, kind of like very like much directly putting these things forward. So okay, everything else is nice, but these still are fundamental things. Like how do we address these things? How do you solve these things? I think stuff like that is really cool because like kind of like lets kind of like a new developer and a researcher kind of like come into space and see okay, like where can I have the most impact basically? Like what are kind of like the pressing questions going on here? To avoid them from like maybe getting bogged down or like trying to like really like just like rediscover things that happened in the past. These are kind of like what's at the forefront basically. How do we make sure to push things forward? So I think it's also important to like not oversell stuff. It's like okay, like we're still figuring stuff out basically. We've definitely come a long way. Things are a lot more usable than right now. Like scalability is a lot better as well too. But there are these things that we're still working on basically to make sure we're like get the full credit on our extra credit, right? Not like have like a partial submission that maybe doesn't really fulfill a lot of the kind of requirements or goals that we set out to do.
Yeah, right. And I'm also curious as well. I know there's been more work around anchor output channels, and that's actually in the new version 0.13 of LND. That's becoming the default for Node to both support anchor output channels. And so does that help with the fee, with that transaction pinning problem, or is there an interaction there or not at all?
Yeah. So it helps because like there's something that added. I think Matt kind of like led it to kind of like basically add like what's like an exception in some like edge case that kind of like led to some of the pinning behavior in Bitcoin D itself. Right. So basically the idea is like always like okay, well you can kind of like have like this one more output basically, and because like the other party doesn't really control that output, I can then like use that as kind of like a CPFP thing to basically get back into the chain. So it definitely helps a lot in that domain. I think another thing that we kind of like realized over time is that like opt-in RBF was added to kind of like placate certain companies at the time that basically really wanted zero conf, things like Coinbase or whatever else, people that kind of really wanted that. So I think we're realizing as well that okay, it has some warts maybe we just need to go to full RBF. And the difference is like opt-in basically you have to like signal on the transaction, okay, well this is replaceable. Full RBF is basically okay, well I can replace anyway. So I think the thing anyway is that like I feel like this stuff is very fuzzy at times because once again, like it depends on what the miners are running, right? They could be running full RBF, and if they are, then that's fine. And like a lot of things get a lot simpler as well too, because you don't really know exactly like what the relay network is running or what the miner is running as well too. It's kind of a thing where it is still super fuzzy. So that's why I think people talk about these attacks as well too, things like that. But like it just seems like at times like they have like a Goldilocks model of like, okay, well, like the fee is just like low enough where it's not getting dropped in the middle, but it's not high enough to basically be confirmed. Things like that as well too. So I think in practice, this stuff is probably a lot more difficult to like pull off than some people like feel like it is. But at the same time, because it's there, we should definitely address these these factors to make sure we're kind of like making sure that things are as airtight as they can be security wise.
Got it. Yeah. And so with Taproot coming, I'm curious as well your thoughts on whether there is potential to use something like Music 2 as part of Lightning Network and the way Lightning nodes talk to each other. Is that something you're looking at? What's the thought there?
Yeah. No, definitely. I mean, so like, definitely like, it generally can just like compressing down a lot too. Like, I think the one thing people will be like as well too is like, right now, like, once again, like people are generally these like public stats about the network, but kind of like looking at like what are kind of like, P2H outputs type thing, multi-type things, whatever else. The cool thing about this is like, this basically lets, any transaction look, any given transaction also like kind of like blend in, right? So the Lightning channel could look at the number of transactions as well too. I think this is cool in the context of things like, pool, where it's like, okay, well, people are kind of like have these accounts, urban accounts, things like that as well too. That can basically just look like one, big multi-input, multi-output transaction basically, right? So I think it definitely like does a lot to kind of like increase like the anonymity and enhance privacy for the individuals. I think the other cool thing is like once again go back to some of those things that we talked about as far as kind of like this like root UTXO kind of like unrolling process, because you can kind of like basically encode different possibilities in the Taproot tree and not really have to commit to that itself. That kind of like really opens up the design space for like what can we really be doing in general. So another cool thing that it allows like something people talk about in the past, this thing called like a PTLC, which rather than like using like a payment hash, like a hash function for like the actual kind of like a payment identifier using Lightning stuff today, you can instead kind of like use like discrete log based kind of like security primitives, things like signatures, EC stuff as well too. It really builds up the design space. Then you add DLCs on top of that as well too. So I think it's a thing where it's like I feel like the design space is basically just so large once you add stuff like that itself, and then it gets even larger as well too. So I think one thing we're working on in the background, I think Rusty and some other people have like different ways of doing as well. Basically the ability to kind of like update a channel on the fly, right? So one thing, is like, right now, if someone wanted to basically like upgrade to a Taproot channel, they'd have to like actually close the channel on chain and open another one. Obviously, that's not good because like, we have like over 40,000 channels right now that once again, like you're saying, it's going to take several bucks to do that, right? So instead, there's a way to basically like, so let's say like I have like a normal SegWit channel output itself. So then like you and I off chain basically we spend that transaction, right? Then we have a new transaction, then it creates the Taproot output, right? And then we actually just keep that off chain, and we never need to publish that unless we actually need to force close. So the thing is, it's actually the same thing, because otherwise you basically need to close and then open. And in this case, maybe I have like an extra transaction whenever I need to close. So once again, that's is a really cool thing. We can, in theory, kind of like update the entire network on the fly to these new versions without actually doing any on transactions at all, right? So then, as more and more things, come up, let's say people are doing DLCs, multi-hop setting, they're doing, other, kind of like, more elaborate channels, things like that as well too. So it should be the case that where it's like, as long as you have like this 2 of 2 multi-sig type construct of like the channel, you can then upgrade that on the fly as if you were downloading like a new application on your phone, right? So I think that's like where I definitely we can get to. So I think is really important as well too, because obviously we want to be able to kind of like, incorporate the latest and greatest, to and basically give them to users without basically having the users close channels on chain. Because like one thing is like, once you get on Lightning and like you basically you never want to close that channel. You kind of like, oh, I have to pay on chain fees, how long is it going to take, blah blah blah. So like the one thing we can do basically like kind of like reduce the number of like on chain transactions due to kind of like control interactions of kind of like modifying parameters, things like that. I think it's definitely like a big thing going forward. But I mean, I guess that's the other thing. Like we kind of like yet to really get together and like make a big push to kind of like do all the designs. For kind of like post Taproot Lightning, definitely a bunch of like mailing list posts from people like AJ and other people kind of like kind of game planning, what can we do over here, and things like that. I think it's the case where it's like it's a thing where we probably just need to like have something very simple to begin with and then go from there, because otherwise maybe it's gonna like get really bogged down in terms of like trying to like do everything all at once. I think the other thing is like if the world is opening up a little bit more now, like definitely we really get to get back kind of like in-person meetings with developers. So I think those are very, very high bandwidth. People talk about a bunch of things as well too. We have like we had one in Australia and Adelaide, Rusty's thing like 2 or 3 years ago, and like that itself was foundational for everything we're doing right now itself, right? So even like one meeting over the course of a few years was super important. So I'm looking forward to basically speaking with people in person again and getting back, getting me space going, just because like once you're back like with the Miami conference, talk to my developers, like, okay, like this is kind of cool. This is why there's human interaction. Like it's cool.
Yeah, that'll be great to see. So another thing I was interested to chat about is this whole idea of spontaneous payments, and I know that's something coming up in the new LND. So I guess this has gone through all sorts of different iterations, right? Because in the past, people have used, they've had to make a new invoice to receive donations or just to receive money. Then there was KeySend, and now we've got this spontaneous payments idea. So can you tell us a little bit about that? What is that?
Yeah, super good question. So typically the way payments work in Lightning today, you kind of have an invoice and they have a payment hash, right? And the way it works, you basically have an HCLC. You kind of extend this thing in kind of an incremental manner, this the whole routing portion of it basically, until it gets to the destination. Then the destination then actually reveals the pre-image and then goes all the way backwards. Then boom, payments are fulfilled, right? So push payment spontaneous payment works a little bit differently because instead, rather than the receiver generating that secret value, I generate it myself. I then encrypt it in the onion payload of the actual payment I'm sending to you itself. It gets all the way to you, then you decrypt that and then settle that yourself, right? And that's kind of the initial KeySend version, right? So basically, so initially we did something, we did that. It was meant to be kind of a little bit more temporary, but then some things like AMP take a little bit longer than we expected. But then AMP kind of builds on top of that, and that there's something called MPP, multi-path payments, basically lets you kind of split payment up into several different shards, basically send that to the individual. So AMP does that for KeySend, right? So all of a sudden now you can then kind of do that same thing where I can push you a payment with only public key, and then split up payment up in general. This is really cool because now this lets you do things spontaneous tipping. Maybe you have a Substack type of thing, where you have a podcasting or whatever else. Something that people really like as well too. And it's also kind of the foundation, of things like Sphinx that kind of do push payment. Maybe add a little message from the podcast and that stuff as well too. So definitely something pretty excited about. Definitely it took a little bit to realize in software, but we definitely learned a lot along the way. We have a bunch of other cool things coming up as well too. One other thing, it lets you also we use an invoice more like you would a normal kind of Bitcoin address, right? So rather than me needing to fetch an invoice every single time, which has issues as far as maybe it's stale, they already pay or whatever else, I can just kind of have that one identifier and then do that more directly, right? So there are things like LN URL and offers, there's other kind of pros by Rusty, they kind of let you do that. But the difference with that is those are still interactive, and I basically need to fetch an invoice from you every single time, right? So it is nice to basically kind of have that one indent type of thing. Where imagine in the future, let's say I'm renting a scooter and it has a QR code and I do an AMP payment to that, right? And boom, it's there, right? And that can work. So it's kind of an example, compress it down the steps a little bit more. And I think it's really cool. So one of the other things that people are trying to combine with that is for example, Lightning basically lets you kind of attach arbitrary key value pairs in a given message, right? So kind of metadata, right? So in the future, I could say, okay, well, I'm tipping you on Twitter, and I add hey, thanks, love the podcast. I add a little message there, right? And you then see message to the other side as well too. That message once again is fully encrypted, end to end to the individual. Things really cool because unless people kind of do a lot of experimentation as far as what can you do, what kind of cool things prospect adding small amount of metadata in the protocol to a particular payment, which I think is a cool thing.
Right. Yeah. So this is going to be very handy for people who are online and they want to have just a static QR so they can start taking donations with this kind of thing, where I guess historically they would have had to set up, say, a BTC Pay server, which might be difficult for people who are not really deep into this world. And then even then, if they had to set up the BTC Pay server, they would also have to set up the corresponding channels and have inbound liquidity, and they'd have to kind of manage all of that aspects. So in this case, I mean, it looks like they would still have to manage inbound liquidity, but at least now it's just one QR. So there's not interactivity, right?
It just simplifies the just the exchange a little bit more. And I think another thing as well that is that something I was kind of fearful of a while back, but I guess it really happens. For example, if I have a deposit address, it's actually an invoice, and I pay it basically, and let's say I want to deposit again, and I use that invoice again, I can potentially actually lose money, right? Because at that point, the pre-image is already known in the network basically. So if I route through those same period, they can just take it. So I think in practice it hasn't really happened yet, which is definitely super relieved about that. But something like this would basically make that not possible, because in this case, the sender is the one that's responsible for always generating that random identifier, right? So it's kind of a thing where you could imagine someone forgets refresh a page and it's just sitting there and they do it again because QR codes it's hard to distinguish things like that. But I think that's cool. I think another funny thing I've noticed is I feel at least here in the US, many restaurants can now kind of basically have the menus on QR codes. I remember when I first getting into Bitcoin, I was oh my God, they're QR codes aren't going to work. It's the only thing, only works in China, whatever else. But I think now it's the thing where it's the average individual just uses the QR codes every day. And it's just a thing. Because I remember there were a bunch of people who were kind of naysayers on it, said the UX was bad, where now it's the normal. So I think it's kind of a cool thing as far as people kind of transitioning and also kind of Bitcoin and influencing, and also kind of opening up the pathways for new ways to exchange information on the internet.
Yeah, that's cool. The QR, definitely the QR conversation is definitely with all this stuff over the last year or two, it's been a lot more QRs. So then I guess in the future that could be maybe some Bitcoin wallet developer builds up on the new version of LND and they build in this feature this capability to just put up a static QR. And that would be really useful, because then I know there would be a lot of people who are not necessarily hardcore Bitcoin people, but they might be a YouTube creator, or they might be a Twitch streamer, and they can just put up one QR, right?
Exactly. Yeah. I remember, there's this like developer. I don't remember their name, but like, they use basically like LN Bits. And I think also like the LN Bits developer, I think his name is Ben. They kind of like have a thing where like something called OBS, which is kind of like this like open source software people use to typically do Twitch, things like that. So basically they integrated, Lightning support into OBS such that if someone like pays your invoice, you basically have like an overlay pop up, on the actual Twitch stream itself. I was like, oh, this is sick. Like, that's definitely where I think, things are heading. Because at that point it's like, okay, well, it's just very direct, between you and the streamer itself. There's no other people, in between that itself. But I think the other cool thing is like, I don't know if you've seen, but typically people like add like a message whenever they do like a donation or a tip. You can then also actually add the message, in the Lightning payment itself. Right. So it's kind of like a fully end-to-end thing. And this is definitely like, example, like a lot of like cool innovation that's possible just by kind of like, having like a more open payment system underlying it, because many of the times people want to do things involving, move money around. That's kind of like the fundamental, like a value of like, actually having some of the internet, like an email type of thing. So I think anything that basically make that like, more frictionless, more open, more accessible, is definitely like a very big thing for just, everyone.
Yeah,
so.
That's cool. And also just around MPP versus AMP, could you just clarify what's, the current state of play there in terms of LND? Like it obviously supports MPP, but now you're looking at this idea of having AMP as well. So can you just outline the differences there for listeners out there?
Def. Yeah, something that we're definitely working kind of like having like more documentation around. But so like so basically both of them can do payment splitting, right? It was like a big thing because like initially like you like a single channel basically had to have the capacity to satisfy your payments. So therefore you kind of like had to have like very big channels. That kind of had a bunch of like issues as well too. So in this case, because we can do payment splitting, it lets things flow a lot more directly. So the difference is like so MPP actually uses the same payment hash for every single kind of like payment shard within the route itself, right? So this is like works in practice, but it has like kind of like two issues. One is basically privacy. So people can kind of like correlate payments if I have different nodes. So I have like two different nodes, different hashes basically, and say, okay, well, those are probably the same payment. Why didn't reuse the payment hash directly like that, right? One of the things like because like the receiver actually has a preimage for MPP, it is possible. Once again, I'm not sure if this is actually in the wild, where someone basically like pulls too early, and because they pull too early, maybe it was like a bug in the software or whatever else. That kind of like means like they can never get the full amount of the money, right? Because now in this case, if they pulled early and then someone else like sends that payment again with the same payment hash, they can potentially lose money because the individual takes that money in path, right? So once again, that's never happened, but it's kind of like just like something as far as like the way things work security wise. But AMP is different because like AMP on the other hand like actually has like every single shard have a different payment hash, right? Now this is cool because obviously now they probably have a different amount and different payment hash as well. So you kind of like have things be a little more diffused, maybe potentially like a little more difficult to actually correlate, right? And one other thing with AMP versus MPP, so like whenever I'm doing kind of MPP, I basically need kind of like a full invoice. The invoice has the payment hash, like your pub key, things like that as well too. With AMP, in theory, I only just need your public key, right? So that means that the invoices can be even smaller, or even if I just like have your public key from some of the things, a very small thing, 32 bytes, I can like push your payment more directly, right? So I think the main thing is like so AMP is basically about like pushing things directly, spontaneously without requesting an invoice, while MPP kind of like requires that implicit round trip for me to get the invoice in the first place, but then has kind of like other constraints around the payment hash, how those things are done, things like that.
So then I guess theoretically AMP is a little bit more private because, as you were saying, it's a little harder to correlate. Obviously, if there's different pre-images for the different chunks of Bitcoin that you're sending along the different routes to get to that other person. And then would it be any more difficult from a routing perspective? Like, I guess what you're saying there is MPP is giving off a little bit more of a routing hints or routing clues inside the invoice, whereas AMP is just saying, hey, just pay to this node. And so basically it's relying on, let's say, my wallet or my Lightning node has to have its view of the network and know, I know I'm paying Laolu's node over here, right?
Not necessarily, because you're kind of like doing the same thing basically. So maybe with MPP, like in theory, you don't want to like, reuse a node in the route, because if they get the preimage a little bit earlier, that could be a weird thing as well too. But I think the other thing, like from like, I think the cool thing is also is like, the routing nodes themselves don't know if you're using MPP or AMP. Right, they're just saying, okay, well, you gave me the pre-image, I took my little fee, I'm good. Right, so I think it's a cool thing as well too. I think also like because the way Lightning is set up, like because like these two things were kind of like end-to-end updates. Assuming you have kind of like the new protocol to like add the routing information within the internal network. Basically, at this point, like any two people can start to use it, right now. And so I think it's a cool thing as well, because like Lightning kind of like allows like a lot of kind of like innovation at the edges, right? So two people can basically start, as long as the sender and receiver know what they're doing, they can do a bunch of other things, on the network itself. And the router themselves don't gain any other kind of like additional metadata. Maybe they see, okay. I think that's the other cool thing too, is like, because like the routing size, the routing packet basically remains fixed size the entire time doing the processing. They're not really able to distinguish, okay, well, that's a podcast payment. This is, a subscription payment, things like that as well too. So I think it definitely kind of like, shows like the cool things that we added into Lightning to basically make it like, extensible over time, but then also, just like allow things to evolve a lot quickly. So we definitely, it's really impressive everyone that banded together years ago to like start to make this thing, and now it's becoming more and more real every single day. And also I remember like there was a thing on Twitter the other day. It was kind of like a video of the Lightning conference that we had in Berlin. Like I was like, oh shit, that took me back. That was
Oh
so
man,
sick.
I can't wait for another one.
2022. Yeah, we'll see. Yeah, so I think something definitely needs to happen, and it'll just be bigger and better now. So definitely looking forward to that.
That's cool. So I guess maybe my summary of it then, or at least my understanding then, is MPP really was the first one that kind of came live on the network, and I think that massively helped improve the payment success, because then you didn't have to have all the liquidity in every step of the route. It just could split up and go across. And now what you're talking about here is we're having AMP, which is like maybe a little bit more, arguably a little bit more private, and some slightly different features there, but basically a similar kind of function. And then potentially in the future, once Taproot comes live on the network, then we're going to have like the Taproot PTLC AMP, right?
Yeah, and I think the cool thing as well, we realize like Lightning is cool because over time you can basically add more and more payment types, right? First we had MPP, then we had AMP. Like maybe someone will have something, for example, Showbase like working on things like being able to like send kind of like a DLC type contract over multi-op channels, things like that as well too. I think this is like an amazing thing because like first now we have kind of like an open payment system, this like kind of like open like monetary rail that we can evolve over time, and I think that's just like an extremely powerful thing. And once again, like, I think the cool thing is like people don't need to ask me to use Lightning. They just download the software and they use it. Boom. I don't know who they are. I don't know where they are. So I think it's definitely like a super amazing thing. I think so. I feel like at times you kind of get caught up in like the day to day. It's like, okay, well, stepping back, like like people done a lot of really cool stuff. And once again, just like people didn't know each other, they kind of like banded together for this shared goal over the internet. So I don't know. It's definitely really cool.
That's cool. One other feature I saw in LND 0.13 is pruned node support. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah.
And why are you enabling this, and what's involved with that?
Yeah, super good question. So like, before now, we know people would actually like use kind of like a full Bitcoin node with a Lightning, node or LND, whatever, or some other places as well too. You kind of like had to like have like all the disk space there. So like, right now I think it's a point where it's like, it's like over 300 or so gigabytes or else. Something that becomes a lot more primitive. I think also like, if people were wanting to be running on like, kind of like smaller, cloud, offerings basically, like, small IBM, things like that was like super expensive, right? So things like, it actually technically worked before this, but like we didn't really want to promote it because we kind of like knew there was like, kind of like some certain edge cases, right? It's like, let's say your node was offline and the channel got mined basically, and then it was offline for a while, maybe something happened, and then like at that point, like the block got pruned. And then in this case, like LD would come on and say, okay, well, I need block 22. It doesn't exist. What do I do? Right. So the thing, it was one of the things where it's like, in practice, it was probably okay, but we didn't really want to recommend it, directly. Right. So what we ended up implementing, in LND is that, now like, once again, because we kind of like have like this code base from Neutrino, companies like Light Client, we basically like, reuse a lot of the kind of like code there for like, P2P interaction. Like that's what we'll do now is like, if we ever go to fetch a block from Bitcoin D and it's not there, we'll then actually just fetch it from the P2P network itself. Right. So this means that you can now kind of like have like maybe like, like 100 megs or whatever else allocated to your Bitcoin D node. And if LND ever needs to do things like a rescan or go back to other blocks, things like that, I can basically just fetch it from the peer-to-peer network. This is really cool because now it's basically like, once again, like lowers the cost of operating a Lightning node, because now you don't need that like 500 gigabyte like SSD on the side of else. You can kind of like just have your initial like maybe like a spinning drive 100 gigs or else. So I think it's definitely a big thing in terms of like lowering the barrier to entry. I think as we're seeing things pop up more and more in other countries where maybe like these things we take for granted cost wise maybe aren't the same to them, other areas, hardware costs, things like that. Also in particular, we're seeing now it's even harder just to get computer hardware around the world now due to like things the ports are kind of like clogging up, COVID related stuff. Costs of just raw goods are going up as well too. So anything that we can do to make operating a Lightning node cheaper, I think is definitely a really big win for people around the world.
Cool. So essentially, LND will connect to peers and retrieve a pruned block.
Exactly. Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah.
Cool. And so also around mobile wallets and things, and this is also calling back to what you were saying earlier, how there's the protocol is there, and that's the base thing that's going on. But then around the edges, there are people out there doing fancy things to make a nicer user experience for their users. So, examples of like the Phoenix Breeze and Moon, where they, as an example, Phoenix have like a routing hint to an unannounced or private channel that doesn't exist yet to kind of make it easy for. And then this idea of on-the-fly channels, or channels that are created just like that don't exist yet, but when you take the payment, it makes the channel then, and then there's a little bit of trust involved in that initial period while you're waiting for the channel to settle and things. So I guess how does that what sort of things do you see coming in the mobile application sphere for the new users who are just new to Bitcoin and Lightning? And how do you sort of see that interacting back with, say, LND and C Lightning and Eclair and things?
Definitely, yeah. I mean, I think what you're saying. Like, I feel like over like the past like 2 or 3 years, I think like the UX of wallets have like really like increased significantly, basically, right? Compared to like when we were using back in the day. I think definitely people like Async and Breeze have really kind of like led the charge there moving as well too. Kind of like once again like they were able to like add new things to the protocol because things are very extensible to kind of like meet the direct goal of like increasing the UX for the end user. I think that's a really cool thing where it's like they're like, hey, can we have an API? Like, okay, cool. Boom. Then they use it. Then I was like, oh, that's what you use the API for. That's really clever. That's really cool. So I guess like maybe things that I see popping up in the future as well too. I think maybe ability to like kind of like have like other applications kind of like ask their mobile wallet for certain permissions possibly. So like you can imagine let's like have like a game, and that game kind of like gets like a macro from LND and saying, okay, well I want to like like bet on who's going to win like the basketball game, something like that, right? So you can like have that interaction more clearly there. I think one other thing we've been like kind of like re-examining the company is kind of like starting to like possibly like get LND and like Lightning kind of like closer to the web more directly. So like it's kind of like feasible in the future. So like let's like actually have like LND like used to be called WebAssembly, which is kind of like this like VM type system that runs directly in the browser that can kind of like have my LND node running directly in my Chrome extension browser itself, right? I think it's really cool because now like you can kind of like have like more kind of like seamless interactions with like the web itself. So like rather than like me clicking, getting an invoice, getting my phone, copy pasting, scanning, whatever else, I just like click it and it does the thing right at that point. So I think it's really cool because now at this point it's like okay, like if we're like that close to the browser and the web, why do paywalls exist, right? Stuff like that, right? So once again, something like drives me crazy. You're like, okay, I want to like read the article and I want to then okay, $60 yearly subscription to Wall Street Journal. I don't really care. Like I just want to give me the information. Here's 5 sats. So I think if we can like kind of cross that barrier, that would kind of like really unlock, I think, just a lot of earning potential for like different like writers, journalists, things like that as well too. I think another thing that I think would be cool is like like the ability to kind of like have like a protocol amongst like different wallets to kind of like allow you to do, kind of like bill splitting, on like the actual thing itself, possibly. So like, you can kind of like feasibly, collaborate to generate kind of like, payments that pay another individual in a way using something like AMP as well too. Whereas like, we all kind of like, pay individually and they can't pool until everything's there. I think that's like, one interesting thing there. But I think generally just kind of like, enabling people to like, have more like seamless applications there, right? To kind of like, cut down on some like the QR code scanning, tap, copy, paste type of thing and have it like, more directly there. Because I think that's really cool. Because now at that point, like, developers, rather than them like, trying to like, basically makes the application a lot more easy to develop, right? Because at that point too, I can just like say, okay, well, wait for user payment. Okay, collect it, boom, and then go forward there. I think other, things in that direction are kind of like, you're trying to move forward with things like, LSAT and Aperture, kind of like, allowing, people to kind of like, build APIs to like, more easily like monetize what's going on. Remember, I saw this really cool thing. It was definitely like a work in progress. Basically like, so one thing I don't know if you've seen, like, so a bunch of like, people like Travis CI kind of like, they run kind of like contingent integration. Basically like, let's open source software, people kind of like, run tests on the infrastructure, things like that. Basically the random people were like, people are basically like mining, on their platform, right? Like, obviously like random coins over the rails. So like they're having like a bunch of issues with like fraud, things like that. So I'm like, okay, well, what if I just paid you 100 Satoshis? Like once again, this is the whole, hashcash spam type of thing. So I think it definitely has a lot of potential. I saw someone that basically made a thing where it's like starting to go in that direction where basically you can kind of like, pay in real time to the application, and the application itself would then like, keep a VM alive for you, right? So I think it's a really cool thing because all of a sudden now I don't really need to sign up. I mean, obviously there's kind of like some trade-offs there as far as like, control and security, things like that too. But it's kind of like this like, more, distributed computational storage type of thing that doesn't really need too much kind of like, novel, cryptography for developers because like maybe again, practically this is like fine as right now. We kind of like just need that kind of like, payment layer there, and we have that right now. It's getting better, every day. So I think there's a few things that I think will be really cool to start to see going forward.
Excellent. And in terms of fees on the network, that's something where I think it's extremely low right now. Like basically most of the time when you're writing a payment, we're talking 1 sat or less, right? And
oh yeah, you forget about it.
Yeah, we're talking like 0.036 of a cent or something like in that range, right? I wonder, does that rise up over time as people start to, because I think at the start it was maybe more like a training wheels and people were just doing it as a hobby, but then over time that you would expect that would rise because every Lightning routing node operator has on-chain fees to cover they've got a liquidity, they're locking up money into a channel, and they obviously want to do that entrepreneurially. They want to open a channel in the direction that they think funds are going to flow. So I'm wondering, do you have any ideas on, that aspect of fees rising over time? Like, would it be kind of like 0.1% or 0.5% longer term, do you think? Or we still don't really know?
Good question. I feel like it's definitely going to be a thing where like, I feel like kind of like the market dynamics will like sort things out over time. Like, so you can say, okay, like maybe like, let's say like blocks, right now, like, let's like hash rate drops even more. Like, we have like another 25% down, like a week or two, whatever else, blocks get a lot slower. You can say, okay, well, fees will start to go up, on Lightning because, there's just so much demand and they realize like I can charge, 0.5%, people will still do it. Right? So maybe then you see go up, but then I think you see like, as like, more and more people like, get into the queue, they kind of like go back down again, right? Too. I think the other interesting thing that, once it develops a little more is probably interesting. It's kind of like, kind of like the cost of like ML liquidity on something like pool as well too, right? Like, would you be able to kind of like, look at that like rate rising over time and see, okay, well, there's kind of like the interest rates are increasing. This means that people wanting to be, borrowing more as well too. If they go, then like maybe like, then maybe people like, see that rising rate, then kind of like add even more capital and that goes back down again. Like what we see, typically in other, kind of like lending markets, things like that as well too. So I think it'd be a thing where I think it would definitely regulate over time. I guess I'm not super worried about it like, staying very high for long. Just once again, because like, there's so much competition because once again, it's a global thing. It's a very open thing. As long as you're able to make those channels and actually have connections there, you can then start to like undercut individuals. And then once again, you'd go back down, right? So it's definitely an interesting thing. So I think, right now, they're probably like, a few categories of users. Like one, basically, they don't really care about the fees. They want to just like, run a node. I think it's really cool. And maybe there's people that maybe, starting to like break even when they consider the routing fees. I think the other individuals kind of like, way ahead of the curve, actually making, money, maybe like fueling associates, a month, things like that as well too. So I think it's definitely cool. You kind of like have that gradient basically. Over time, you probably like need more people that, are doing it more for like a profit seeking perspective, basically to make sure they kind of like more sustainable. Maybe they have like more uptime, things like that as well too. I think it's one of the things where, I think the market forces will like, sort of assess that like the on-chain fees will be like a very like hard ceiling for what fees would be comparably. But at the same time, you can like have like, a period of time where things like, go, wax and wane. So one thing that like, I think it's interesting, which I guess like, do I have this data? It's like, for example, like, you can actually look at the current like advertised like, fee policy of every single node in the network to see, okay, like, like what's the like average fee rate on the network right now? Is it, 0.25%? Is it 0.5% as well too? You even like, watch that. I think like a cool graph would be like, what's like the median or average fee rate advertised compared to like, the like backlog of fees or the mempool size, right? So I think it'd be a cool thing to like, overlay over each other. Maybe there's some like, slight correlation, there right now. I imagine over time it becomes a little bit more tightly correlated, but it's something that, maybe someone's like, maybe someone has a bot and they're doing this already. I don't know, but like, it's kind of like, things as far as the design space there that, people will definitely be looking at more in the future, but maybe right now it's kind of a thing where things a little bit younger and they're fine because they're okay with losing some money on chain fees because Bitcoin is up, right? So so they're cool with that.
yeah, and so maybe it's just over time the tooling and everything, and Lightning dashboards, Lightning terminal. I know you have these terminals and dashboards allow people to maybe tune their fees like a little bit like a knob, and you sort of see, oh, okay, there's a lot of congestion right now. It might be like in the future, like if people say there's a supply chain shortage, so therefore the cost of whatever this car is really expensive, maybe in the future it's going to be like, oh, actually there's a lot of miners moving over, hash rate is down, so Lightning fees, Lightning routing node operators have had to turn their fees up a little bit to compensate because they're paying more for on-chain fees to kind of manage the undergoing liquidity. But it's always this constantly shifting game, because at the same time, you're batching things as well, because you might be doing you might be loop in, loop out, like batching all these things in and out. So it's I guess it's kind of complicated to see where it ends up.
It's definitely kind of like a very like interesting design space. There's probably like a bunch of really cool research papers to be written here, some like master theses, things like that as well too, like analyzing the space, things like that. So I think it's a thing where it's like, because I feel like, in Bitcoin, like typically like, the practice is it's typically like beyond like where the theory is, which is like maybe sometimes, really people just like do the thing basically. Then over time, people start to kind of formalize it more and more. So I think we definitely start to see like a lot of people, come up with Lightning as far as like, how to like optimize your channel, how do you like select your channel, things like that as well too. Like, I think it's really cool because like there are a bunch of like really committed people kind of like in the trenches, doing these fermentation basically, advertising up on Twitter. There's a bunch of like Telegram groups, like you have to like, pay to get in, all this other stuff. So I think it's really interesting that you kind of, have like this like iterative process basically, people finding out, all this knowledge, like spreading it, and like then it's catching up with software, the protocol, things like that as well too. So it's definitely like a, super interesting system, and one that obviously never existed before. And it's pretty cool.
That's awesome. So I guess anything else before we wrap up? Like what's your outlook outlook over the next, couple of months in terms of what's going on in the Lightning space? Do you have anything else you wanted to bring up?
Yeah, I mean, I guess as far as where L&D is right now, I think it's a thing where I think one thing we're starting to kind of focus on is making sure L&D can keep up with the scale of where Lightning is right now. So I think it was in the beginning, we kind of making some decisions earlier on, because okay, maybe we're going to kind of serve all the type of users, mobile nodes, Raspberry Pi, things like that as well too. I think it's saying, okay, well, people are running such large nodes, doing such large traffic, maybe L&D can't really keep up. So we're definitely, focus on basically making sure, which obviously it's a good problem to have. Okay, they have 10 million invoices. 2 years ago, that was that was fake, but now it's actually legitimate. So we're definitely working on making sure, L&D can keep up with that new load. It was starting to work on, kind of standardizing a bunch of other things happening in the protocol, things like LNURL as well too. Starting to look at kind of what Taproot kind of allows for the system as far as having more expressive types, things like that. I think the other cool thing that you definitely can't ignore since coming up with more and more is kind of DLCs, how those interact with Lightning itself, how we would do on chain, who's going to be the oracles, things like that as well too. Because I think at that point you definitely have a really cool set where if I can have that in my channel, I can kind of enter into these different agreements. Maybe I can do certain types of hedging. Maybe I can try to express my view on where things are going. I think it's a bunch of really cool things in there. Also kind of obviously the continual evolution on pool, starting to basically do things have streaming interest rates. Things let me kind of let me kind of sell the cash flow of my lease payment to you over time as well too. I think there's a bunch of really interesting areas there, and just generally kind of making things Loop more efficient as far as having less things on chain, kind of having these temporary swap channels. Definitely a lot of really cool things people are working on right now. It's just a few things there. I feel like the hardest stuff about this stuff is always picking what to work on, because there's just so much stuff. There's so many opportunities, options, things like that. There's definitely how to be kind of a little more disciplined and focused, and try to focus on what you think is the biggest value for your users at the same time. But then you also acknowledge that, okay, well, people probably fill that niche on the side that maybe we ignored, but that's good because that's just kind of the marketplace.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I'm really excited to see what's happening in the Lightning Network, and I'm a big fan of what you're doing. Thanks for all that. And so listeners, make sure you follow Laolu. You can find him on Twitter. His handle is @Roastbeef, and you can find Lightning lightning.engineering. Anywhere else you want people to find you, Laolu?
So we have our Twitter account. That's just twitter.com/lightning. Definitely check out the GitHub. That's github.com/lightning network LND, and then also the specifications, kind of what we talked about the bolts. Those are right now, or github.com/lightning network lightning-rfc. And there's definitely some initial points as people start to interact with things and join the community.
Excellent. Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, no problem. It was dope.
Get the show notes at stefanlivera.com/289. Find me on Twitter @stefanlivera, and I will see you in the Citadels.